Among the things that Henry V heard as people were trying to persuade him to go to war against France was that he had in his history, in his family history, that England had in its history, the examples of valiant warriors. And so Henry V is challenged to live up to their example. And so here we have a bishop telling Henry V early in the play, awake remembrance of these valiant dead, right? These valiant warriors who fell in battles, in the past, in history. And with your puissant arm renew their feats. Puissant, French word there meaning power. With your powerful arm renew their feats. Live up to their standards. You are their heir. You sit upon their throne. The blood and courage that renowned them, that is, the blood and courage that made them famous, runs in your veins. Notice that appeal. If you want to be famous as they were famous, here's how you do it, right? Go to war and live up to the example of these ancestors that are being referred to. The Duke of Exeter then encourages Henry V in the same way. Rouse yourself, as did the former lions of your blood, as did your brave ancestors, right? Well, I was thinking of this and kind of the burden that leaders might sometimes face when they face the prospect of war, and they have in their minds the prior examples of leaders in a time of war. And when I read those quotes that we just went through in Henry V, I think most of Lyndon Johnson, the president most associated with the war in Vietnam. Now, every president from Harry Truman to Gerald Ford, all of them have some connection to the conflict in Vietnam. But more than any other single president, I think Lyndon Johnson is linked to that war. One of the things that's kind of heartbreaking about President Johnson is that he becomes president in November 1963. John F. Kennedy, the president, is assassinated. Lyndon Johnson is the vice president. And so in November 1963, Lyndon Johnson becomes president. We get into 1964, the next year, the first year of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. And we have telephone recordings of him where he's speaking with members of Congress. For example, he's speaking with a senator. I have a particular telephone conversation in mind. And Lyndon Johnson is speaking with the senator at a time when the Vietnam War actually is not much in the news. It's a pretty small thing. If you look at the graph there, the number of troops in Vietnam in 1964 is very small. Hardly anybody's paying attention to Vietnam. And yet Lyndon Johnson is on the phone and saying, what does Vietnam mean to me? It doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't mean anything to this country, right? But yet, as we look at the graph, we see that in '65, Marines go into Da Nang. We have a bombing campaign going on from South Vietnam to North Vietnam. You see in 1967, the number of troops goes up. 1968, the number of troops in Vietnam goes up. Lyndon Johnson decides in 1968 that he won't run for the presidency again. And so then we see the numbers drop off as President Nixon then moves in. So the growing number of troops in Vietnam, up to about 500,000, a little more than 500,000 when we get into 1968. That is very much to do with Lyndon Johnson. And yet we can hear him speaking very early in 1964 saying, what does Vietnam mean to me? Why should we get into this war? And yet not only does he persist, but he gets the country deeply involved. Why? And that's a huge question, and I think you could devote a good part of a career to studying it. But one thing we know, and it's related to the theme of this video, is that Lyndon Johnson very much felt the pressure not to be the first president to lose a war. Of course, we have the decisive victory of the Second World War that ends in 1945. Franklin Roosevelt, leads the country through most of the war. President Truman finishes that war. Then we have Korea, that's a little more complicated because the war actually doesn't officially end in 1953. An armistice is signed. The war kind of ends where it begins, so that's not a clear victory, but neither is it a clear loss. And President Johnson does not want to be the person who walks away from a conflict and lets it appear as if he let a country become communist, right? If the United States does not get more deeply involved in South Vietnam, then South Vietnam is likely to go communist. In the Cold War, to walk away from a country and then to see that country become communist, that's a defeat. And there's something in Lyndon Johnson's psychology that actually is not very hard to understand. There's something in his psychology that says, man, I am not going to be the first president associated with defeat in war. The irony, of course, is that he is very much that president associated with defeat in war. And we're not going to go here, we're not going to go into the tremendous complications and difficulties of that war. But what's one of the things that caused Lyndon Johnson to persist on a path that he himself in 1964 said he did not really believe in? Well, I think we can go back to that appeal that we read about, or that we read from this early part of Henry V, right? Remember, the feats of Franklin Roosevelt, of Harry Truman in the Second World War. Live up to their examples. There was that sense of pressure, I think, when it comes to Lyndon Johnson in that war. Another example would be George Herbert Walker Bush, who in 1991 led not only the United States, but a huge international coalition against Iraq to liberate Kuwait from Iraq. Iraq had invaded Kuwait. George Herbert Walker Bush leads an international coalition to push Iraq out of Kuwait, and is tremendously successful. Well, we have President Clinton following George Herbert Walker Bush, and then we have George W. Bush, right, the son of George Herbert Walker Bush, and Iraq is still a problem. And when we ask the questions about, the country going to war against Iraq in 2003, invading Iraq in 2003, what were the psychological conditions in the White House? What was the state of the president's own psychology when he makes that decision? And then, when early on it seems that the United States has gotten an easy victory in Iraq in 2003, just as there was an easy victory in 1991, when it seems that the United States has gotten an easy victory, George W. Bush himself later acknowledged that he seemed a bit brash, right? That he seemed a bit perhaps arrogant, declaring mission accomplished, declaring major military operations are over, of course, not knowing the tremendous difficulties to come. And I just can't help but to think that one of the things going on in the mind of George W. Bush was this great victory his dad had in 1991, and a desire to live up to that, to have an equally stunning and brief victory. But of course that doesn't work out. Now when we think of these valiant dead, we can think of victories, look back on the Second World War, look back on the Gulf War, right? The liberation of Kuwait in 1991. But we can also look back on valiant dead, but to see that the war they fought in was a different kind of war. It did not produce victory. It did not produce national unity. It did not produce national elation. And Vietnam is, of course, that kind of war. And there develops what's called the Vietnam syndrome, that, most of the conflicts, and certainly all of the big conflicts that the United States has gotten into since Vietnam, people have raised the Vietnam comparison, the Vietnam syndrome. And so we can look at cartoons that show this. In this case, remembering the valiant dead, but in a negative sense. No more Vietnams, right? No more Vietnams. In this case, as a leader, President Obama, for example, I don't want to preside over another Vietnam. President Clinton, for example, thinking about the possibility of conflict in Somalia, I don't want another Vietnam. And so in the case of Henry V, the pitch is, remember the positive heroism, right, of the warriors of old, and let's live up to their lofty example. But we can also remember the warriors of old, and we can appreciate what they sought to accomplish, and we can appreciate their valor in battle. But the outcome is very different, right? The outcome. And so we could also say, remember that, and therefore, let's be cautious as we move into this conflict. So you see here, the movie title is Vietnam II, the Afghanistan Story. And there are a lot of similarities in, kind of how those wars operated, how those wars proceeded. You see on the sign in the back it says Vietnamistan, right? A movie that's coming. And the man says, we've seen this bad movie before. Why do we keep coming back? There's that Vietnam syndrome. And truthfully, when I read articles about Afghanistan, it's hard for me not to think about the experience in Vietnam. Here's Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld for George W. Bush, who says, some seem not to have learned history's lessons, right? But the cartoonist, of course, is saying, well, Secretary Rumsfeld, I'm not sure you've learned the lesson, right? The lesson of Vietnam. So sometimes in history, leaders will look back at the valiant effort of soldiers in the field, and the outcome is positive, at least for the victorious side, and we want to live up to that. In other cases, we may look back on the valiant effort and say, well, the effort may have been valiant, but the cause itself was problematic, or the outcome was difficult, and we want to avoid that. In both cases, I guess, to get at the point here, it's important to try to learn history's lessons. The difficulty is knowing exactly which lessons to apply and how to apply them.